Good evening, happy Thursday, and welcome listeners across the country and around the world. You're listening to X-Bulletin, the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers forums, powered by your stories and narrated by yours truly, Browningate, also known as Bill 720 on the forums. Let's talk about the show itself a little bit here to kick things off. X-Bulletin. For those of you long-timers of XDA Developers, this is probably background knowledge to you, but the site, prior to a year or two ago, when they switched over to, I believe, Xenforo, whatever the hell that's called, used to be run on a platform called V-Bulletin. V-Bulletin for years, alongside PHPBB, was the de facto engine or back-end system for online discussion forums. And even to this day, there are a lot of forums that are run by that. Looking at their website, it seems that it's actually kind of been neglected. It didn't change basically for the prior 10 years. So I think it's kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit, but we still all thank it for its service. And it's one of those things that will go down in history as one of the most important technologies of the early and middle-aged internet as we move into the postmodern era that we find ourselves in today. Now, about the show itself, why are we starting yet another mobility podcast? Obviously, I'm not Azrionok, I'm not Mr. Mobile. I seek to blaze my own trail and do my own thing here. This show is all about me. It's also about you. And if you have any thoughts, what I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to hammer this home all night tonight, email your thoughts to xdapodcast@outlook.com, or you can post them in the appropriate section of the XDA Developers community forums. I have to put that disclaimer on there because I am your favorite forum moderator, of course. You're also welcome to leave those in the comments section on this very YouTube video or others like it that pertain to the X-Bulletin forums. Anyway, the nucleus, the purpose statement of this show is really to deliver an experience unlike any other. I want to provide you with the content that you actually want to listen to, not the content that you should want to listen to or that the mainstream press wants you to think you want to listen to. This show, we're going to dispense with all the bull crap. We're going to get rid of all the mainstream modern day nonsense. We're just going to talk about mobility, and we're going to tell your stories, and we're going to tell my stories too, because those are pretty interesting, at least in my opinion. I might be a little bit biased on those. This show is beholden to no one. There is no producer except me. Most importantly, there's no co-host. Shows that have, 3 or 4 people and fancy microphones and expensive editing suites and brand new computers and 80-inch monitors, and they're compensating for something. And I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but I'm going to say that they're compensating for something. This show is unaccountable to anyone. There's no YouTube monetization that I'm going to worry about content ID matches on for music, television, movie clips, whatever we play in the show. I don't give a crap. This is not my full-time job, so nobody's paying me for this. This is a volunteer position. I do it out of the goodness of my heart. There's not even any management to answer to. This is not officially sanctioned by XDA. I'm not anyone's puppet, least of all XDA Developers is, although I thank them for letting me borrow their logo a little bit and cash in on the name recognition. But this show is as unofficial as it gets. This is bare bones. I'm recording my voice into a cell phone, reading off of a one-page Word document with a very loose outline of what I plan to say. But this show is unscripted, largely, and it could go anywhere. We may even touch the third rail of podcasting, that being politics, and it only gets better from here. Obviously, I have no formal broadcasting experience. I have no podcasting experience. I have no casting experience of any kind, unless you count Google Chromecast, and even that I'm pretty new at. So we're going to see where things go here. There's still so much more to come on X-Bulletin tonight. You're not going to want to miss it, including the mid-evening rant, mobility stories, the unpopular opinion of the week. But first, let's take a look at our moderation highlights coming out of the break.
going on here?
Never mind that, Crump.
Hey, don't touch that! Whoa! I told you. Hobbs, you got a problem here. Jesus Christ! Oh, get off that goddamn thing! Find the rope, Rusty! It's time! Get to swing that thing side to side!
The G5 rose out of the ashes of Apple design failure like the iBook G3 and the PowerMac G4, which themselves were believed to have been inspired by the 8th generation Buick Riviera.
Oh, no, you've got to go downtown, George. It's all downtown. Just like the song says.
The song?
There's your answer. Downtown.
I don't know why, I just find it highly amusing to watch an all-in-one computer running without a screen. Little throwback to 2008 there. Welcome back to the show, the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers forums, powered by your stories. Every once in a while, we try to class things up here a little bit and bring you an alternative point of view. To that end, tonight on our moderation highlights, I'd like to introduce to you live, hopefully not via satellite unless it's through Starlink, our very own beloved senior moderator, Timma. Timma, welcome to the show. Anyway, I do want to get into the moderation highlights for this month. More accurately was last month's, since it was the April 1st joke. That was something that obviously got a lot of attention, a lot of popularity, a lot of airtime on the forums. With the whole Open Al. Open Al was the character that you created, the world's first artificial intelligence moderator, although there was a bit more to it than that, as we'll find out here with the strings being pulled on it. It wasn't as magic as people might have thought, but I think you had a lot of people going with that. That was a gag that I really quite enjoyed. I think with XDA, there's a certain expectation that every single year, the April 1st joke has to be a one-up and better than what we had the prior year. And what a lot of people, I think, don't understand or don't remember about this was that the impact of this was felt not only by the members of the site, but also by the moderation team. The Open Al character was actually taking a lot of the post reports that were coming in. So can you walk us through, at least briefly, what the inspiration was for the Open Al character, how that came about, how long did you have that in the chamber? Was it something that that you had ready to go for a while and just now decided that this was the time for?
Yeah, sure. Well, the whole idea of having XDA do an April Fool's Day prank all started last year. I think it was just 2 days beforehand that we realized, it's almost April 1st, we should do something. We just jumped on it, and I created the mock-up for the forum violation passes. And Will from Portal got also excited about that. And, we got in touch and we talked about it on the moderator part of the forum. And pretty soon, Open Al was, I think it was back in December. We were brainstorming about this, what are we going to do this year, because it has been such a crazy experience last time, and we just decided to go for AI. And since Open AI released ChatGPT, it's been everywhere around us, so you can't really avoid the subject. So I thought, let's make a prank out of it. And then we decided on having an AI moderator, which seemed like a fun idea. Also, a lot of things to think about there. But I actually got to work with ChatGPT. Didn't have much experience with it, and I talked with this system for days on end. And since it remembers the conversation, it actually really got into the role of being Open Al. Well, Open Al was by the way based on Al Bundy actually, because we have this running gag amongst the moderators, especially the senior moderators, that we're all just lazy people, uh, which we're not. But yeah, we gave him form, and I made the profile. I made some professional looking images and made it look a little real, but also not too real and still funny. And I think it worked out pretty good.
And as with any April 1st joke, I think a lot of people, especially the more experienced ones, understand that it's a joke. Many of them play along, some of them don't. Now, among the people who maybe didn't get the joke right away, which are always the favorite ones, especially with an April 1st joke, was there any reaction that stood out to you as where we really got the person, we really nailed someone?
Yeah, yeah. Some people got pretty angry, actually, but I think that reflects the current discussion on artificial intelligence, because there's a big social dilemma around that, and it's probably not a good idea to give an AI full moderator privileges and let it loose on your forum. I mean, they tried that on Twitter once, and I remember it didn't end so well. So
Yeah.
maybe we could get there for some basic things. I think we could have a really great AI guide. I think that would be pretty cool, but yeah, we're not there yet. Anyway, about the gotcha responses. So people got sometimes pretty aggravated, angry. But they gave OpenAL a pretty hard time. Some of them.
Really put it through its paces.
Yeah. But at some point, Alex, one of our forum moderators, approached me. Also, a kind of spur of the moment idea, because he has this other account which has been banned. Just some technical thing we had going on in the past. Not too long ago, and he had this crazy idea to make it look like OpenAL had banned one of the forum moderators for making a mistake, and we just had that going on via PMs, just between Alex and I, and it was pretty bold, and we just did that. And I replaced the author of the posts in the thread we were doing this with the banned account. So it looked like Alex, but a banned Alex. And yeah, it was pretty. Yeah, I think it was pretty on the edge, and it even startled some of our own moderators. Like, whoa, what's going on? This guy's banned now. I think if they really looked further, then you would easily see through it. But there was some pretty heavy responses. I think it was one of our new moderators that was like, "What? Can get banned for just making a mistake? Are you crazy?" So
Well, I'm glad we got at least someone with that.
yeah, of course.
That's always good.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that thought it was just didn't respond. We're like, "Oh my God, what's going on? What's going on here?" But on the other side of the spectrum, I really want to mention this. The best response OpenAL got was by far from one of our members called Jenny. Don't know if I pronounced it correctly. And she had launched back in November, I think, an AI thread, which has become pretty popular. And I used OpenAL, to go into her thread and say, "Hey, I just noticed your thread. It's pretty cool. You have a thread about AI." And her response was to die for. It was fabulous. She was really, really excited, and I really got into that excitement and her endless energy on the subject, and it was a heartwarming moment.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, this is probably one of the more memorable April 1st gags from the site that I can remember in quite a while. Obviously, the forum violation passes that you mentioned, those were a good one too. I think that was last year's.
Yeah.
Yep, those were extremely hilarious. So obviously, I'm sure there's always a collection of these. Maybe somebody's got a folder full of these just hanging around. Can you tease anything in particular for next year or in the years to come?
Yeah, well, as I said, we had a brainstorm in the form of a preparations thread on the forum, on the moderator's side of the forum. I think we collected about over 10 ideas that we can run. Some of them maybe not as funny, and some of them a little too daring for a public forum of our size. But
all right. Well, I don't want to pressure you to give away too much to the listeners, especially since it's a.
We're not gonna let anything go until we just drop the joke. But
Yep.
yeah, it's possible. This could be an April Fool's Day tradition for XDA. We'll see how it grows.
Yeah. Yep. There's so many of these are just quite enjoyable. These last two especially.
It's a fun interactive moment that can be binding for the community, and also for the moderators. It's a rare moment that we can actually cooperate with the people at Portal. We're very different aspects of XDA, and these cooperations make it shine that we propagate what we stand for. Just profound tech discussions and just having fun.
Yeah, yep. As one of the, I believe it's still among the 10 largest discussion boards in the world. That's a title that you don't reach overnight, and
over 2 decades.
Yep, over 2 decades. I mean, if you think about it, and we're probably going to go into this in later segments of the show, but I mean, I know that the torch kind of got passed where PPC Geeks was kind of the king for a while, at least on the CDMA side in the early 2010s. Prior to that, in the late 2000s, I think Modico, and then they just kind of wilted, and the discussion drifted over to XDA rapidly. And I mean, at this point, it's basically them and Reddit that's left. And obviously with Reddit, there's so many disparate communities. It's not as tied together as it is with XDA. But at any rate, Tim, I thank you so much for joining us here. We are going to move on to other segments, including the ever popular Mobility Stories community favorite Unpopular Opinion of the Week. But first, our mid-evening rant. Folks, you're not going to want to miss those. Stick around. Calling all would-be advertisers. How would you like to shill on X-Bulletin? Well, now you can. Email xdapodcast@outlook.com with the word podcast somewhere in the subject line of your email message to let me know that you're interested, and we'll see what we can work out. And now, back to the show. Special thanks again to Tim for joining us for this inaugural episode of X-Bulletin, the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers Forums, powered by your stories. Now that we've got our moderation highlights for this month out of the way, I'd like to move on to the mid-evening rant. Tonight's rant, we're going to be talking about the topic of camera quality in mainstream smartphone reviews. This is a topic that has really been underrepresented, and that's why I feel like it's ripe for the picking here for me to be able to rant about it for just a couple minutes before we move on to the next segment of the show. This was something that really came to my attention a few years ago when I took possession of the Samsung Galaxy Note 10 Plus, which is my everyday carry. This is a device that on paper should have really good camera quality. It should have been out of the park, easy peasy lemon squeezy, no problems whatsoever. The hardware's solid, the reviews said it was good. The camera quality was not even a thing that I could possibly comprehend as being an issue with this. But from the very first picture that I took with the Galaxy Note 10 Plus, I realized one very important thing, and that is that I simply cannot trust the mainstream reviews on much of anything. I mean, even the good ones, even Mr. Mobile himself, Michael Fisher. he glossed right over the cameras when he reviewed the Galaxy Note 10 Plus. And the thing of it is, this is not a new problem. This is a software problem. And I go into more detail on it in my review video of the Galaxy Note 10 Plus. But the long and short of it is, the hardware is capable of really good things. The Google Camera app, which saved the day on the Essential phone, and the mainstream reviews actually acknowledged that, and rightfully so. I was extremely, extremely skeptical of any claim that just installing a different software package would magically fix the problem. But in that device's case, somehow it did, to my absolute amazement. The difference between the Essential phone and the Galaxy Note 10 Plus is that on the Essential, the unofficial port of the Google Camera app can fully replace 100% the stock camera app on that device. Every single thing that the stock camera app can do, the unofficial port of the Google Camera app can do as well. On the Galaxy Note 10 Plus, that's not the case. As I pointed out in my review, I've got 2 versions of the Google Camera app, plus Google Camera Go and the Samsung app, depending on if I'm shooting videos, stills, which camera lens I'm using, if I need the flash, and if I'm using the front-facing camera. So it's doable. I'm capable of getting good pictures out of it in any condition across those 4 applications. It's just one of those things that I shouldn't have to do, and it does require using a little bit of brain power prior to launching into one of them, depending on what I'm photographing or recording a video of. And that's the sort of thing that bothers me. This is a remnant of bad old Samsung that's been around probably for 10 years or more, where their software for processing the pictures over-sharpens the crap out of the image and makes it look like a watercolor painting. By the time that software is done just grinding that image into oblivion, you're left with this goofily colored mess. It looks like a watercolor painting. There's no detail to it whatsoever. The pictures, I mean, they're okay if you don't zoom in and you're just looking at it in portrait on the phone's screen, but any objective scrutiny of it reveals that it's just a bad picture. It doesn't produce good images. And this has been a problem with Samsung for a very long time. The mainstream reviews never mention it. This is not a problem on Apple iPhone. It's not really a big issue on the HTCs. The LG stock camera software is pretty good. But Samsung, undisputably the king of Android devices, they still haven't been able to shed this last remnant of crappy software. And nobody in the mainstream press seems to be willing to point that out. You have to go to the forums for it. I didn't find out about this until after I spent $400 on a used smartphone to figure out that the mainstream reviewers are full of crap. And that is something that I find to be deeply disappointing. Now, I was actually talking to Tim about this in the break, and he pointed out that a lot of those reviews are sponsored, or the reviewers get a sample of the device. And that is valid, but I'll point out that I've received review samples before. When I did that Huawei Honor View 10 review video, that was a brand new device straight from the manufacturer, and they let me keep it. In fact, I sold it on eBay when I was done because the device wasn't all that useful to me because it didn't support any of the LTE bands that I needed it to support on the network I was on at the time. But it was a decent little phone, but I did not hesitate in my review to call out how awful the cameras were on that thing. That would have been a brand new device, I think in 2017, give or take a year. And my daily driver, my 2015 era Moto X Pure Edition, had a very, very good camera on it. And I showed the audience in my review side-by-side samples from the camera apps on those respective devices. Now, with that said, would there maybe have been a port of the Google Camera app that would have made the pictures look better on that device? Maybe. I didn't know at the time. I didn't even know that was a thing back then, unofficial ports of the Google Camera app. You know, you learn something new every day. But I pointed it out. But for some reason, when reviewing cameras, nobody ever thinks to do side-by-side comparisons with other devices. And I think the audio gets overlooked as well. Nobody does side-by-side comparisons with the microphones to see if the waterproofing of the device makes the sound more muffled. I can say definitively that the best microphone I've ever owned in a mobile device is in that Moto X Pure Edition, just because that's a slightly less water-resistant device, or at least that's my theory anyway. And that's a topic that I think is criminally underrepresented in the mainstream press. The only thing aside from that I think that really gets overlooked frequently is whether or not the device has a stereo microphone, because if you're recording video, you want there to be some degree of stereo separation and be able to hear stuff that was recorded on the left side of the video in your left ear and stuff that was recorded on the right side of the video in your right ear. That's my thoughts on the topic. What are yours? Feel free to start a thread over on the XDA Developers forums if you'd like to have a chat about it. If you're watching on YouTube, leave it in the YouTube comments section, or just email xdapodcast@outlook.com. As always, include podcast somewhere in the subject line of your message. Still to come, my personal favorite segment, Mobility Stories, and the ever-popular, unpopular opinion of the week. Stay tuned. Well, would you look at that? We're still pretty light on sponsorships for this week. You can change that, however, if you've got a little extra money to spend and invest in this spectacular program. Email xdapodcast@outlook.com. Include podcast somewhere in the subject line of your email message. Now, back to the show. Happy Thursday and welcome back. You are listening to the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world famous XDA Developers forums, powered by your stories. And this, like every other segment on the show, is my favorite segment, but this one is especially important. Mobility Stories, the nucleus of the entire X-Bulletin podcast series. The most important thing to keep in mind is that the thing that makes any piece of entertainment medium interesting, for the most part, with some exceptions, is stories. Any podcast you've listened to, book you've read, television show you've watched, movie you've consumed, video game you've played, all those things, the core component that made it the best was if it had a good storyline. So that's why this is what I leave for second to last. And to that end, since this is a show about mobility, I figure the most appropriate thing I could possibly talk about here on our inaugural episode would be my own mobility story. And to adequately tell that, I'm only going to tell the story of one chapter of that, otherwise we would be here all night. It starts with the Palm M500. Palm M500 would have been released in the year 2001. I was in first grade in 2001, so I obviously wouldn't have owned it back then or had much use for it. Although, even back then, the idea of portable technology was one that was very novel to me. In the year 2005, I received as a gift a broken Palm M500 handheld, complete with the dock station and everything. And it was in the process of researching the repair of this device when I cracked the manual and figured out just what it was. This was unlike any toy handheld that I had owned before. And granted, some of those things may have had some kind of ability to run additional software or the ability to interface with a computer, but nothing, the Palm ecosystem and the Palm OS operating system, this was on a whole different level than anything that my fifth grade mind could possibly have comprehended. And I tried my absolute hardest to repair that device. I got out, torque screwdrivers, because in those days those devices were relatively serviceable. Borrowed a torque screwdriver set since I didn't own one, carefully unsnapped the back cover, tried replacing the battery, and I probably ended up breaking that device in my effort to repair it by jumping the gun with a power supply before I got a proper, suitable power supply that could run the device. I hooked up one that was for lack of a better term, unsuitable for the Palm M500, and I probably blew it up doing that. I ended up selling the device. I never got it working again, but from that point forward, my eyes were opened, and I was never able to be satisfied with anything less than this sort of device. It had to be Palm OS. This was just a very eye-opening experience for fifth grade version of me, and this arguably changed the trajectory of my entire life. I don't think it would be an understatement to say that. If I hadn't discovered it, I probably would have latched onto this sort of thing at some point not too far down the road, but this inevitability happened at that moment in time for whatever reason. And I began scouring eBay, which was the eBay of 2005 and 2006 was very different from the eBay of today, but it was also very different from the early days of eBay, the early 2000s, what I consider to be the Wild West of eBay, when you could really, find hidden gems and get good deals on stuff. Today, it's scalpers and people, buyers and sellers, trying to game the system any way they can to take advantage of other people. In those days, you could still sometimes get a good deal on stuff. And what I found was that sometimes items would get misfiled or sold under keywords that were less commonly searched. Now, the Palm M500, this was Palm's flagship device. It ran their software on their hardware, similar to how Apple iPhones run iOS, the Google Nexus series or Pixel series runs Android. For a while, we had Nokia branded devices that ran Windows Mobile Phone 7 series and its successors exclusively. In those days, you had the Palm operating system ran on Palm hardware, and it also ran on other brands and stuff too. You had Kyoceras, you had Handsprings, and I think several others. And IBM had a very special relationship with Palm in those days. There was a line of devices called the IBM WorkPad, which was meant to be a play on words and capitalize on the popularity of the ThinkPad line of portable computers. The WorkPad actually dated back to the earliest Palm devices, and there was a IBM branded version of the Palm M500 called the IBM WorkPad C500. They didn't even change the name that much, but the casing was identical, the innards were identical, the components were all identical. Even the buttons were the same. The only thing that was different was that the casing was black instead of silver. It had an IBM logo on it instead of the Palm emblem, and that was literally it. Not a lot of people knew about that, or at least people who were actively searching for these devices on the used market, and they were relatively popular, being that it was only a few years old at that point. But I somehow stumbled on one that was mislabeled or misrepresented as, and I think it had IBM or Palm in the subject or in the title of the listing somewhere, but it did not have anything. It didn't have the model number there. So that was the most critical thing that caused it to be overlooked by other buyers. It was labeled nurse paramedic, LPN, RN, PDA, or something to that effect. Somehow I managed to stumble on it. It was only $20, give or take, if I remember correctly. So I had my parents buy that for me. I reimbursed them with cash. I got the device. It was in mint condition. It maybe hadn't even ever been used. It didn't actually have any of the medical or doctoral software on it that it was supposed to have, but I didn't care. Maybe the device had sat in the supply chain too long and the memory had gotten wiped. But the Palm M500 and its sister, the IBM WorkPad C500, was what one blogger described as the last in an increasingly refined line of devices. And I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that sentiment, but to me, it was just the most awesome thing ever. It was a grayscale device, and most Palms after this did have color displays, but this was a very good grayscale display. If you've ever heard of a device called the Pebble Watch, which I actually did a review on years ago on the channel, actually I think a couple videos I did on it, and I actually still have one of those to this day. Those use a reflective LCD screen, which is different from most LCD screens that we might expect to see on a flat panel television or computer monitor or laptop or even a smartphone that uses an LCD screen. Reflective LCD screens actually excel in sunlight and in outdoor environments. and they don't necessarily require a backlight. This would be the same kind of screen if you've ever used a old school Game Boy or a Game Boy Pocket or a Game Boy Color. Those devices also would have had an LCD screen that was reflective in nature. The M500 did have I believe it would have been considered a front light, but it did have a way of illuminating the screen. It was a little bit unusual in that it would feel kind of inverted at first, but in the dark it was actually very pleasant to look at. But this device would be one that would excel in a business environment, in the home, outdoors, anywhere that you need to be able to see the screen without having to make use of that backlight. A very different kind of display technology. I'll throw some of the specifications up on the screen here if you're viewing on YouTube, but if you're just listening, the most important thing you need to understand about this device, aside from its rather archaic processor architecture, which Palm and the other manufacturers were still clinging on to for Palm OS at this point, was the memory. In those days, what you have to understand, and I know a lot of you are probably too young to remember this or to understand it, but for those of you who do, this will be a review. For those of you who don't, this will be quite a revelation. Storage in that period of time, really everything up to prior to the mid-2000s, storage of any kind, especially computer storage, was insanely expensive. Even by today's standards. Back then, it was laughably expensive. So the device did have some, I believe it would have been flash ROM, but it had some ROM storage on it, but it would be too small to be actually useful in any meaningful way. So what they gave the user instead was the ability to use the memory as storage. The memory is, of course, backed up by the battery. There may have been a battery backup in these devices at this time, or some kind of a capacitor or something, just in case the main battery were to die. The M500 was one of the earlier Palm devices that actually had a flat rechargeable battery built in, instead of just using conventional cylindrical batteries that the user would just replace every so often. These devices were very, very frugal when it comes to power. So even though the batteries might be kind of small by today's standards, these devices would last for days and weeks on end on a single charge. So it's not like you were having to worry about recharging it. And what you did with the device, given the performance envelope of it, was relatively limited. So it's not like it had the same duty cycle as a modern smartphone that we would think of today would have. So that was a limitation that carried up through, I know, up until probably the mid-2000s. I think between 2003 and 2005, this was still pretty standard practice, using the memory as storage. One of the advantages to that actually is that it's very fast. Even today, RAM is one of the fastest mechanisms of storage inside of any computer of any kind. So it was, even back then, a very low overhead operation. So what they gave you as kind of a consolation prize was an SD card slot. This was one of the first Palm devices that would have had that feature, and obviously it would be limited in terms of the size of cards that you could put in there, but that gave you at least some form of permanent storage that the device could utilize. And of course, I had SD cards by this point. Given that I had a camera in those days, I would have considered myself to be some sort of a trailblazer back then. Whether or not I actually was would be debatable, but given that I was very familiar with SD cards, this device would just naturally fit into that ecosystem, and so it had that as a option for expandability. The other thing that it had, of course, was that dock connector. The device was originally shipped with a dock station called the HotSync Cradle. You would have either gotten it with a USB cradle or with a serial one. My broken Palm M500 I got with a USB cradle, which I kept, and then the IBM branded one that I bought actually came with the serial cradle. And the physical attributes of the cradle itself would have been identical. One would have just ended with a USB cable and had the USB wiring inside of it to the correct pins on the universal connector on the device, and the other one would have had that for serial. That connector was useful for other things aside from just the dock station. I know there was a keyboard accessory that could be attached to the device for, entering of text in a more effective way than just the handwriting recognition system, which was called Graffiti on the Palm devices. That system, and I'll go on a quick side tangent here, I will mention, actually fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life in another way, that being handwriting. In the Palm graffiti system of handwriting, and you had to use this particular system for inputting of text on that on the silkscreen area on the device's display. And this was actually arguably quicker even than the on-screen keyboard, given the slow refresh rate of the screen. Those letters had to be entered in a very specific way. The one I can tell you to this day that I still carry with me in my actual handwriting is the letter Y. The letter Y required that you cross the tail of the Y in a single stroke, and you had to cross the tail, otherwise it would not recognize the letter Y. So to this day, I still draw the letter Y with that single stroke tail cross. But other things could be done with that accessory port aside from just the keyboard. I believe there was some kind of a modem accessory that worked with it. There may have been one that hooked up to Ethernet or other networking devices as well. I believe Palm OS 4 did have some rudimentary networking capabilities to it. In fact, at this point, I'm almost positive that it did. There were even, at some point, some devices with some cellular functionality, if you can believe it, from Kyocera, that being the 6035 and the 7135 smartphones that would have had, I believe, some kind of cellular data capabilities to them, even if it was basically just glorified dial-up. And then you had the Palm i705, which would have been very similar to the M500, except it had, I believe it was, it wasn't cellular in the way that any cell phones or cell phone systems implemented it at the time. It was a network that I believe was called Mobitex, and you can tell I didn't research any of this ahead of time, but the Mobitex network was available with that device. It actually dated back a few years to, I believe, the late 1990s, and it would have gone on to be available up until the late 2000s. It never gained national traction, but it was one of those early trailblazing technologies that was available, not necessarily with this particular device, but it laid the groundwork for the i705, which I believe was, in terms of hardware specs, almost identical to the M500. So there was definitely some stuff you could do with it, but what was really groundbreaking at the time, aside from just the one button press synchronization known as HotSync, and the software that ran on Windows or on Mac OS or Mac OS X that could facilitate in that process, it was basically a one-click backup system that would not only synchronize everything but back up the entire device in one fell swoop, no questions asked, was that it could run its own library of software. And unlike any toy class devices that I had owned up to that point, Palm OS was very mainstream, very popular in development. It was the Android and iOS of its day. If you had software that you wanted to have published for a mobile platform, Palm OS was the place to do that. And there was even at that time, a huge library of software. Even though by that point in the mid-2000s, Palm OS 4.1, Palm OS 5 with its ARM architecture, and the devices that utilized the ARM architecture had overtaken the old Motorola architecture of the Palm OS 4 devices and its predecessors, there was still a lot of reverse compatibility because developers recognized that there were still a lot of these old school Palm devices. Even at that time, technology moved quicker than it does today in terms of a device that was 5 years old being considered obsolete. Whereas today, you can use a decade-old device and you're still in pretty good shape. Despite that, there was still a huge commitment to reverse compatibility in the development community at the time. So there was a huge amount of software, much of it freeware and or shareware, that was available for this device. So I loaded it up with all kinds of applications for keeping track of stuff, and especially games. Games was the big thing because it had those 4 face buttons. It didn't even have left and right arrow keys, for lack of a better term. It had up and down, but most games were designed to accommodate for that, and they could take over the second and third feature buttons and basically have you use those as left and right arrow keys, or they would just use the touch input. And so this became a gold mine of software. There was lots of good games, even with the limitations inherent with that screen. You would have had a lot of ghosting on those early LCD screens. there were still some games that were playable on there. I remember I actually had a multimedia card that contained a commercial release of Tetris, and that was a lot of fun. There were third-party releases of Tetris. There were like space shooters and all kinds of good stuff that was available on Palm OS. So when I moved off of that, you know, I always wanted to make sure that whatever platform I moved to had a decent amount of software. And even the device I replaced it with, which would have been an HP iPack, which we'll talk about in a future episode, running Windows Mobile 2003, there was not the same level of commitment to reverse compatibility in those days on Windows Mobile as there was on Palm OS. And I don't know if that's by design or if it just wasn't possible given the development tools that were available. Kind of similar to today, you know, if you publish an app on iOS, the software development tools will force you to target just the most recent few versions of iOS. Everybody else is left out in the cold, and that's kind of how they accomplish forced obsolescence. I don't know if there was the same spiky attitude toward it back then, but at any rate, Palm OS had, as I remember it, really good reverse compatibility, and even new software releases that were designed for Palm OS 5 would have some kind of version that was also compatible with Palm OS 4, sometimes even Palm OS 3.5. So it was a platform with good reverse compatibility. Now, aside from the Palm M500, or in my case, the IBM WorkPad C500, which I used extensively from 2006 to 2008, the device that I carried with me most commonly, aside from this, the device that the Palm M500 would have taken second place to was actually not a music player. It was not a DVD player. It was not even some kind of portable computing device, but it was actually a camera. Obviously, today we carry cameras in our pocket by way of smartphones that have very good cameras on them and have even multiple cameras to compensate for their lack of a zoom lens. In those days, that was not something that we were blessed to have. I had, as I had actually highlighted in a previous video, a Nikon Coolpix S1 camera. That was my primary carry. The Palm M500 would have been my secondary, and then, actually this would have been in 2008. So the Palm M500 came out in 2006, the Nikon Coolpix S1 in 2007, displacing the M500 essentially as my everyday carry, but both were still a very instrumental part of my life at that point. In 2008, there was a third device that joined the club here, and that was actually an Onda VX878 portable media player, actually a little color resistive touchscreen. I did a video on it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on this at risk of the segment just dragging on for way too long and this being redundant. But by this point, I had a trio of devices, and you're probably seeing the problem here. I only have so many pockets. I can only carry so much stuff on me at any one time. So the need was naturally seen to start unifying these pieces of equipment in my life. And the Onda VX878, which was one of the only portable computing devices that I ever bought brand new, would go on to be one of the first ones that fell victim to this. But for a short time, I did have three pieces of equipment as my everyday carry. The reason for that, the Palm M500 actually had what is not a black and white LCD screen like the Pebble has. It is actually a grayscale screen. I believe it was capable of displaying 16 shades of gray, which is actually not as limiting as you might think. I could take the SD card straight out of my camera, put it in the SD card slot on the device, and view the photos. It would take some time to load them, and I'm not sure if this was because of the slow CPU that was in the device, or if the SD card interface was just really subpar. I assume it was probably the former, but it could play the photos, and they actually look surprisingly good. And of course, the Palm had much better battery life than the camera that I was using in those days. So I would often use that just to review the photos that I had taken, however slowly that would take. But obviously, this was not a device that had any kind of multimedia capabilities. There was no watching of videos on this. Even if the SD cards of the day were large enough to store videos of any meaningful size, there's no way that the chipset would be able to actually play back video at any reasonable frame rate, since it struggled obviously with even viewing still photos. So that was out of the question. Even music was not an option. The processor architecture just was not up to the task. There was no speaker, there was no headphone jack. Technically, there kind of was a speaker, but it was just a beeper speaker, so it could make beeps, boops, and clicks, basically just to let you know that you touched the screen in the right place and that you hit a button and that it was doing something. But it wasn't of sufficient quality to be able to play voice or music or anything like that. So these devices could not be music players. Some manufacturers worked around this creatively by including custom hardware on the board. I remember the Kyocera 7135 smartphone in particular in those days. That ran Palm OS 4. It would have been the same old school architecture Motorola CPU in there, but it had special hardware on the device itself that could play MP3s and output the audio through a headphone jack. I think it was just a 2.5 millimeter jack on the device, but it did still have it, so it still counted. And then there was custom built software. It would have been a Palm OS application, but it would have been just for that hardware to interact just with that chipset to make the MP3 playback actually function. So what I ended up moving on to would be a device that could at least combine the functionality of the Onda VX878 and the Palm M500, at least into one, so that I would go back to just having to carry two devices around with me. But that is a mobility story for another day. Up next, our unpopular opinion of the week. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the show, listeners. Final segment of the show, the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers forums, powered by your stories. We round things out, of course, with the unpopular opinion of the week, my favorite segment of the show, or what I hope is going to be my favorite segment. Otherwise, I'm going to feel and look really stupid having said that. This week's unpopular opinion: do you listen to podcasts while driving? Right now, I'm going to tell you what to think, and I'm going to tell you how to think. But you are more than welcome, of course, to sound off. You have many different choices for doing that. As I've hammered home numerous times already, xdapodcast@outlook.com. It doesn't matter what you write, as long as podcast is somewhere in the subject line. If you're watching on YouTube, the comments are, or at least should be, open. Feel free to submit your thoughts through there. There is also a thread on the XDA Developers forums, fittingly enough, and you can feel free to contribute through there as well. But right now, I'm going to give you my take on this. Podcasts while driving. Many of us have a car radio that is either capable of playing podcasts directly over the internet through its own internet connection, via Bluetooth through the internet connection on a paired smartphone, or even just directly on a smartphone with the analog line-in cable hooked up old school style, or even through a cassette deck adapter if you've got one of those. At any rate, here's why I do not listen to podcasts while driving. I like listening to podcasts, and the first thing is, first and foremost, I get enough time during my workday to be able to interact with podcasts while I'm working. I'm blessed to be able to have a position where I can work remotely, listen to whatever the hell I want for a good chunk of that, and that gives me the opportunity to provide all the podcast babysitting that I need to. And what I mean by podcast babysitting is all of the skipping through the commercial breaks. I don't know about you, but most of the commercial podcasts that I listen to have more than their fair share of commercial reads. That's thing number one. Thing number two, for multi-hour podcasts, and there is one of those that I do like to listen to, they get uploaded for whatever reason out of order. And even if they do get uploaded in order, Spotify, in its infinite wisdom, when you play one of those hours, will not play the next one in the correct order, no matter what you do. So the desktop, the Windows version of Spotify at least, gives the opportunity to add it to a queue. And that at least takes care of the listening in order problem. The version of the Spotify Android app that I use does not. So that doesn't work as well on there. At the end of the day, it's just too much interaction, too much distraction between the out of order problem and the skipping through commercial reads. So since I do get through most of the podcasts while I'm working during the week, I just don't listen to podcasts while driving. You might have a different opinion, and your opinion is, of course, wrong, But like I mentioned before, you're more than welcome to sound off in any of the mediums that have been made available to you. You may also even leave a voice memo. Email that to the same email address, xdapodcast@outlook.com, with podcast somewhere in the subject line of your message. If you'd like a call back either during the show or outside of the time when we record the episode, include a Skype handle, a throwaway phone number, or some other mechanism by which I can reach you, and we will see if we can make something work. In conclusion, I thank each and every one of you for joining me for this inaugural episode of the unofficial and last surviving podcast of the world-famous XDA Developers Forums, powered by your stories. This is Browningate, better known as Bill 720 on the forums, signing off.